Hi, Carl. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for coming on the Tailwind podcast.
Happy to be here.
So, we're going to talk about your book, Air-Borne, which came out earlier this year. You've written a number of books about a number of topics in science. Why did you decide to write Air-Borne, which I believe is your 15th book?
Yeah, that's right. The seed for Airborne was in the pandemic. I was working at the New York Times with my colleagues, trying to report out the new science of this new virus as fast as we could. And it turned out that one of the big flashpoints was how it spreads. And, WHO was very adamant that if you just stayed a few feet away from other people and didn't cough in people's faces and wash your hands, that you'd be okay. And there were other people who said, no, we think this is airborne. And that turned out to be the case. And it fascinated me that this would be a debate. Like, I thought this would be pretty straightforward. It turns out that understanding the air around us and, the threats that it poses and the life that it contains is actually like a fascinating, really difficult area of science. It's called aerobiology. And the more I dove into it, the more fascinating the whole science and its history became to me.
So, we've had what I would say from reading your book, we've had a lack of scientific consensus on the topic of the airborne transmission of pathogens. And I think what Airborne covers is that lack of consensus sort of showed itself during COVID and impacted our public health policies during it. Is that fair to say?
Certainly was a lot of dispute about how COVID spreads during the pandemic, and that did affect how we tried to deal with it. And unfortunately, if you are not treating COVID as an airborne disease, you can make a lot of mistakes. You can put yourself in a lot of harm. You can put other people in harm because you're dealing with a virus that can basically spread like smoke.
I would say that the roots of this sort of lack of scientific consensus about airborne transmission of pathogens goes back hundreds of years. And in the sort of more modern era, I would say sort of the genesis of it is really kind of in the mid 1800s. And feel free to go back earlier if you'd like to. But I guess what was the disagreement of the time? There were sort of two camps, right, about how diseases spread.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the air itself, that had been this, mysterious thing that we depend on, but they can kind of threaten us for thousands of years. Everybody knows we have to breathe, but there was also this very powerful idea that the air contained miasmas. This was a kind of a corruption of the air and supposedly could be caused by bad weather or rotting plant matter in a marsh or something like that. And so that if this miasma came your way and you breathed it in, you might get a disease like malaria or influenza or some other disease. That was a very powerful idea and really held on until the 1800s. Now, at that time, there were people who said, we think that infectious diseases are being spread by infectious agents, that is, by bacteria and what would later be known as viruses. And they're going from person to person. And there was a huge battle going on between these folks. And it really took until the end of the 1800s before those people who believed in the germ theory of disease, basically won out. And so malaria was not spread by miasmas, it was spread by mosquitoes, and specifically protozoans inside the mosquitoes. There were other diseases that were spread through the water, like cholera, for example. And so, one by one, all these diseases that once were thought to be spread by miasmas in the air were being spread by pathogens in other media, like water, just physical contact, inside of insects, and so on. And so, basically, by the early 1900s, there was a very powerful consensus that there were probably no airborne germs that you had to worry about. And so the whole idea of airborne disease as a medical issue just didn't really exist. And that remained a very powerful paradigm for a century, until the COVID pandemic. And, in my book, I write about some of the people who, over the course of the 20th century, tried to fight against that and say, like, no, 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 the pendulum's swinging too far. Germs can indeed spread from person to person or to other species through the air, not as a miasma, but just as airborne germs.
I think there was a scientist named Charles Chapin, who I think in the early 1900s, he sort of comes up with kind of a middle ground where he says airborne infection is possible, but it's like when someone sneezes. And if you're close by, if you're within a few feet, you can come into contact with those sort of liquid droplets, the person sneezes out, then you can catch whatever they have. But that disease is not, to your analogy earlier, it's not like smoke. It's not going to hang in the air for hours. It's only if you really come into contact with someone a few feet away and they sort of sneeze on you. And that's the paradigm that endures for quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean, if you wonder where that advice, keeping 3 feet or maybe 6 feet from other people, came from during the pandemic, it came from people like Charles Chapin in the early 1900s, because when they were thinking about respiratory diseases in particular, they thought, well, they're present in our airway, and we have runny noses, or they're in our saliva and so on. So you can get it on your hands and then contaminate surfaces. So that's one way that you could get sick with these things. Or if you just sneeze right in someone's face, bang, you could hit them that way. But like, it's really like thinking of these droplets as like bullets in a gun. Like, they're not going to be able to go very far because they're being blasted out, and then their gravity is going to pull them down. And the thinking was, if just physics meant that they couldn't stay in the air more than 3 feet, they're not really floating, they're not really airborne. That became a very powerful paradigm. I mean, Charles Chapin really was one of the architects of modern public health.
So around this time in the early 1900s, another Charles Lindbergh gets involved in the story. What role does flight begin to play in our understanding of the aerobiome?
So, this idea that there might be germs floating around us, people were able to imagine this even in the 19th century. So Louis Pasteur, for example, he actually made this claim that there were lots of what he called floating germs invisibly drifting around us. And not only could they make us sick, but they were important for all sorts of things in nature, decomposing waste in, forest or in grasslands and what have you, fermentation and all the rest. So how was he going to prove this? Well, he would walk around with a long necked glass flask, and he had sterile broth inside of the flask. And he would wait for the bacteria to settle down, fall down these long glass necks, and start growing in the sterile broth. He would do this in the streets of Paris. He climbed a glacier. He went into the countryside in France, and he was able to capture germs. But obviously, this is just what's floating right around him, And this idea that, hey, wait a minute, the atmosphere might be full of life kind of lay dormant for decades, because how were you supposed to be able to explore the atmosphere? This blanket of gas that goes up 20, 30, 40 miles, we're here stuck on the bottom. And it really wasn't until widespread use of airplanes in the 1920s and 1930s that these scientists that we call aerobiologists were able to start to go up there. And, at first they would just sort of hold petri dishes up like in the clouds to hope they could catch stuff. And they did. And Charles Lindbergh comes into this story because he and his wife, Anne, were going to be taking this trip over Greenland, over the Arctic to Europe in 1933. And one of these pioneering aerobiologists, Fred Meyer, got in touch with them. And they actually set up basically an experiment where Lindbergh would be using a special device to try to catch life in the air. And he did. And it was a huge sensation when the news finally came out, when Meyer and Lindbergh shared the news, because suddenly people would say, whoa, like even 10 miles over the Arctic, like even at these like incredibly hostile environments, there's life. And there's, life that's flowing over the oceans from continent to continent. And it really kind of opened people's minds to the possibility that the atmosphere is its own ecosystem, what we now call the aerobiome.
Let's talk about William Wells. So William Wells and his wife Mildred are key figures in the book. So his story sort of starts kind of, I think, during the Spanish flu. I think the consensus that we talked about earlier that was sort of developed by Charles Chapin and others is sort of that paradigm is used to explain how the Spanish flu spread. William Wells has some skepticism about that, right? And what does he do with his research to investigate that?
Yeah, so when Fred Meyer, who I mentioned before, is flying in airplanes up in the clouds, William Wells and his wife Mildred, they're indoors. They're studying how it is that there can be these floating germs that can spread from one person to another and make us sick. And indeed, like in the 1918 flu pandemic, William Wells at the time was actually serving in the army. He was what's known as a sanitarian. So his job was to keep people healthy in the army by providing them clean water because, it was clear that there were germs in water. And so you didn't want people to get typhoid and other diseases. So you would use filtration and chemicals and so on to ensure that people had clean water. So, I'm sure Wells saved lots of lives providing clean water to these soldiers who were fighting in the front in France. But then people just kept dying around him anyway. They were dying of the flu. And my suspicion is, just having read his letters and unpublished materials, that he and his wife Mildred just looked around at how the 1918 flu pandemic unfolded, how it killed 50 million or more people, and said, this doesn't seem like it's just spreading on surfaces or over very short range. This seems really explosive. This seems airborne. And in the 1930s, they really then began to pull together the evidence to make that case, inventing new technology to actually capture germs from the air, the ability to do experiments in tanks at Harvard and University of Pennsylvania to show, in fact, how this could work. And the basic point of their theory was that we can spread germs without coughing or sneezing, just breathing or talking. We are releasing tiny, tiny droplets, not the big droplets, but tiny ones. And as they float around, they evaporate and they get even tinier. And then they just float like smoke. And if you're in an unventilated room, they can potentially build up and float around for hours. And if they have bacteria or viruses inside them, other people can inhale them and potentially get sick.
Since you just mentioned it, there are these sort of smaller and larger droplets. And at some point, a line in the sand was drawn around 5 microns, right? And what is the 5 micron rule?
So the 5 micron rule was a massive misunderstanding about how airborne diseases work that became really entrenched actually in public health guidelines in the late 1900s. And it has its origins in a weird way in the work of William and Mildred Wells. So they could see already that large droplets, even 100 microns, could potentially float around like smoke. Now, when we inhale droplets, they can get into our nose, some of them can get into our windpipe, into our lungs. But in order to get all the way down to the very fine endings of our lungs, what's known as the alveoli, they have to be 5 microns. Now, when Wells was studying tuberculosis, which is one airborne disease, he realized that those bacteria only grow once they get into those alveoli. It's a very odd way to make a living as bacteria, but tuberculosis is really good at it. A quarter of people on Earth probably have been exposed to tuberculosis. And so it works for them. But you have to be in a tiny 5 micron droplet in order to get all the way to the tip of the airway and get to the alveoli. So he presented that in his papers, William Wells did in the 1930s and 1940s. And in the 1960s, for odd reasons, some prominent public health people looked at that and said, oh, okay, so what you're saying is that only droplets that are smaller than 5 microns can be airborne. So that's it. And it's just not true. And yet, because I think public health was being guided primarily by infectious disease experts who didn't have, a strong background in physics, it just took hold and people just sort of took that as almost just as a given. And really wasn't until recent years that when atmospheric chemists and physicists started to get interested in this field and they looked at some of these things people were saying, like the 5 micron rule, they said, no, that's not true at all. But people were still claiming that there was a 5 micron rule even during the COVID pandemic. It's only just been in the past couple of years that finally that's been taken down and people are starting to recognize the true complexity of how we can spread diseases to each other.
So William Wells he's sort of the tragic hero of the story. in a way. He's clearly he's a brilliant scientist. He does great work, but he gets in his own way a little bit, right? Like his impact on the sort of mainstream science at the time he was doing his work was maybe held back by some of his limitations around his interpersonal skills and his communication skills.
Yeah, that is my sense just reading the archival material, where you will see some of his closest colleagues just saying, like, oh, William and Mildred Wells are their own worst enemies. And, part of the problem was that both William and Mildred were outsiders. So Mildred had gotten a medical degree at the University of Texas, which is obviously very unusual in the early 1900s. She never practiced medicine. She went pretty quickly into raising their child. Meanwhile, William Wells, never had a PhD. He had gone off in another direction after World War One. He was actually becoming an expert on oysters, of all things. And then the Great Depression hit, and the company went out of business, and so he needed a job. And so he managed to get a very low-paying job at Harvard teaching. He was a terrible teacher, but he saw this as a place where he could do some research. He and Mildred did this research on airborne disease, and it really captivated the imagination of people in the 1930s. I mean, this was the stuff of headlines. The idea that maybe we could even protect ourselves from the next flu pandemic by keeping the air safe, maybe with ultraviolet light, for example. This was big stuff in all the leading newspapers. But in terms of really trying to persuade their colleagues, they just failed again and again. They had a very difficult time with the personal skills, the politics, and so on. And eventually, like, William Wells would just go into like rants that would go on for hours, as people describe them, which would not persuade anybody. And eventually people just backed away from him and just said, like, whatever he's saying, it doesn't make sense. It can't be right. And that was indeed, as you say, a real tragedy.
You just mentioned one of their experiments, which was to use ultraviolet lights indoors to kill pathogens in the air. So they did this experiment, and then I think Mildred worked with some other researchers on it as well. And then I think there was another attempt after her. Over the years, like from reading your book, I would say the evidence was inconclusive in the end, and also sort of difficult to really find clearly compelling evidence, because if you're installing these lights in schools, for instance, the kids ultimately go home and can catch something at home and then bring it back. And so would you characterize the results differently than being inconclusive? And do you think maybe another attempt at this is warranted?
Certainly, there needs to be more research on ultraviolet light to reduce the spread of airborne diseases. And there is that research going on right now. But in the 1930s, William and Mildred Wells did the experiments that really demonstrated that this is something to take very seriously. So, for example, they would do experiments where they would put animals like mice or rabbits in a chamber, and then basically through a tube, they would pour in a sort of droplet laced air. And those droplets might have influenza in them or tuberculosis, what have you. And if that air passed under an ultraviolet lamp first, the animals were protected. And that's because the ultraviolet light was killing off the viruses and bacteria in those droplets. And they then installed those lamps in schools in Philadelphia. And in 1940, Philadelphia had a huge measles outbreak. And in the school where those lamps were installed, the kids in those classrooms had a 10 times lower rate of measles than the kids in the other classrooms who didn't have it. Now, measles is really airborne. It spreads very effectively, and it goes from one kid to another. That's how it spreads. So putting an ultraviolet lamp in a classroom, if you're in a situation where measles is rampant, remember this is 1940, way before vaccines, that had the potential to be super effective, and it was. Now, it gets more complex if you are dealing with a number of different diseases and in a more sort of complex environment where the disease can spread in different places. So actually, Mildred Wells undertook an amazing experiment, a ridiculously ambitious experiment in the late 1940s, where she basically talked a town in Westchester County in New York to basically put up ultraviolet lamps everywhere, not just in schools, but in the train station and in churches and in stores and so on. And she wanted to see if she could get a real broad reduction in certain diseases. It did have some effect, but it was clear that people were getting sick out from under those lights. And they were bringing in new diseases because it was a bedroom community. People were taking the train down to New York and then coming back. And so it was a definitely mixed results. But I think that the general thinking now is that ultraviolet light can be a really useful tool in an overall, toolkit for reducing the spread of airborne diseases. So there will be places where ultraviolet light makes a lot of sense. And those could be in places like train stations and schools and other places where lots of people come together and you have that higher risk that somebody's going to give a disease to somebody else.
As we move through the 20th century, the study of aerobiology becomes intertwined with the development of bioweapons. We go through two world wars, a Cold War. How does the US government's approach to the development of bioweapons evolve?
The United States government was aware of the possibility of biological weapons in the early 1900s, but didn't really take it seriously. It was hard to see the way that anybody could use bacteria or viruses as an effective weapon as opposed to, tanks and bombs and so on. That actually then changed at the start of World War II, mainly because the United States government was getting reports that a lot of which turned out to be false, but nevertheless, they were hearing stories that the Nazis and the Japanese government were themselves creating biological weapons. In other words, you can think of a bomb that contains some kind of deadly bacteria. You drop it over a platoon or a city, and it spreads disease and wreaks havoc. So the United States government said, we need to get into biological weapons too. We need to build them in order to, first of all, understand how to defend against them, but then also, kind of like with nuclear weapons, so that we have biological weapons too, so that people on the other side will think twice about using them. That was the rationale that they told themselves. And then they said, okay, well, how would we do this? And it turned out that when they looked at the work of people like William and Mildred Wells, these early aerobiologists, they're like, oh, they've already worked out a lot of the fundamental principles for how you would do this. So they built, literally, they called it an aerobiology building, the new Camp Detrick in Maryland, and got to work. And they essentially built weapons out of all sorts of different pathogens, including anthrax. And they never used them in World War II, but they were starting to produce them in large amounts. And at the end of World War II, it just rolled straight into the Cold War. And the United States now looked at the Soviet Union and said, well, we don't trust them. We think they may be building new biological weapons. And they were. And so now that biological arms race just kept going on and on and on. And so aerobiologists, thousands of them in the United States, the Soviet Union, and elsewhere, just kept building more and more sophisticated weapons. And it wasn't until the 1970s that the United States and the Soviet Union signed a pact that was supposed to stop all this. The United States destroyed its stockpiles. The Soviet Union actually just turned out, they went on and made even more extravagant biological weapons.
You quoted some researchers from the Soviet Union who basically said, yeah, we signed it, but we didn't expect the US to stop either. And so I think they assumed the US wasn't going to stop, so they kept going.
Yeah, it's the same kind of game theory, I guess you could call it, that characterizes nuclear weapons. Like, okay, are we going to make an agreement and then are we going to step back, or are we going to assume that these other people are just going to go ahead and keep doing it anyway? So we have to keep doing it. And, this fact that the Soviet Union kept doing it, actually kept the United States biodefense program going strong as well. They weren't making stockpiles of biological weapons, but they were doing lots and lots of research on it, and they were making this stuff in these weapons labs.
Also in the early 21st century, so you write that basically at the turn of the century, aerobiology is 60 years old. But as a scientific area, it's scattered, it's somewhat disorganized. How does it then go through a revival, and how much does the tool of gene sequencing play a role in that?
So we start to see, new kinds of technology come online that actually help to identify life in the air. Because it used to be that you just had to figure out a way to pluck bacteria or some other organism out of the air. And in order to know what you'd found, you'd have to then be able to grow it in a flask or a petri dish or something. And the fact is that most microorganisms do not like to grow in ordinary laboratory conditions. It's not their thing. So if you don't know the exact recipe to give them to get them to grow, you won't even know what you found. So an incredible revolution happened for aerobiology, as for a lot of other branches of science, when it became possible to just take material. It could be stuff you catch from the air, it could be some dirt, it could be some ocean water, and basically just pull all the DNA or RNA out of it, all those nucleic acids, all those genes, just pull them out and sequence them. And once scientists were able to do that, then they were able to discover, like, oh, actually, there's a lot of stuff that we're catching, a big diversity of things that we're catching that we didn't know about. And so this, among other things, this really helped to get people to think again about the dangers of airborne transmission in a way that they really hadn't since the days of Mildred and William Wells in the 1930s.
So as we get to COVID, how does the scientific community ultimately adopt the view that COVID spreads through the air rather than spreads via droplet nuclei, 3 to 6 feet away? And what is that process like? Like, how much does the community sort of embrace that view with open arms?
Well, certainly at first they did not embrace it at all, and they very much rejected it. So you have this small group of scientists in early 2020 who had, for the previous few years, been resurrecting this idea of airborne disease. And we're finding evidence that things were able to spread like smoke, diseases like influenza and so on. And so when COVID comes and they look at the earliest reports coming out of China, they say, we need to think seriously about this being airborne. And they got in touch with the World Health Organization. World Health Organization said, no, COVID is not airborne. I mean, I'm quoting them. And so that really set up this conflict between people who were saying, look, you have to take this possibility seriously. And a lot of public health organizations, government agencies, and so on, who just said no. And a lot of that was just received wisdom, conventional wisdom. But we know that airborne diseases only spread in droplets that are smaller than 5 microns. We know this, we know that. And so it was a really remarkable period where this fight was playing out. And so the people who were taking seriously the possibility of airborne infection, they looked for case studies. They looked for examples that could really show you how this thing was spreading. It wasn't enough just to look at who's showing up in a hospital sick. So you would have these cases, one of which I write about in some detail, where there was a group of singers who got together for a rehearsal in Washington State in March 2020. And they were following all the rules. They were keeping their distance from each other. Nobody was coughing. Everyone seemed fine. And most of them developed COVID in the days that followed. It was this explosive spread of COVID, turns out probably just from one person. So, when you look at the different ways you can explain how that disease spread, really airborne infection just does the best job. And so, the World Health Organization did, after almost 2 years, did it finally in print online, just say COVID can spread through long range airborne transmission. But it was a long process. And in hindsight, it's tragic. I'm not just blaming the World Health Organization, just in general, that we did not take seriously what it means for that we had a pandemic that was airborne. And, until vaccines came online, we were all incredibly vulnerable to it. People were dying at incredible rates. And there were just a lot of basic things that could have been done differently. And perhaps a lot of people would be alive today who died during the pandemic as a result.
I think you wrote that during the onset of the pandemic, some of the scientists that were looking into the possibility that it was airborne were literally going back to William and Mildred Wells' work, using their calculations. And so it's a shame on a number of fronts that, one, their work maybe wasn't adopted more by the scientific mainstream earlier. I think with that in mind, I'm curious, I might be reaching a little bit with this, but do you think there's, from reading your book, there's been this, it seems like a bit of an inclination to reject the possibility of airborne transmission of diseases just throughout history. And do you think that there's some sort of innate bias that we have against that possibility? Do you think does it offend some sort of sensibility we have, some sense of safety or something like that?
Well, it's interesting that actually, for centuries, people looked at the air as a source of all sorts of diseases because they had this idea of miasmas in mind. That in a lot of ways turned out to be quite wrong. And you can talk, in terms of specific diseases, like that, if you tell me that, oh, you got malaria because you breathed in the miasma, I'll say, no, I got bit by a mosquito. These are totally different things. So certainly, like we, at least in the Western world, like we were capable of thinking about diseases traveling through the air. But it's interesting when you look at early public health experts like Charles Chapin, who we talked about before. The way he put it was, well, essentially he said, people can feel relieved that this burden of worry about the air, infectious air, like is not something we have to worry about because we know we've solved this problem. And it turns out like, yeah, there are lots of things that we do need to be concerned about, keeping our water clean, keeping our food clean, making sure that we wash our hands or so on. But the air, we don't have to worry about. And that must have been a huge relief because obviously we have to breathe, like you just got to breathe. And if the air is full of viruses in the way it, might be full of smoke of someone who's smoking a cigarette in a room you're in, like that's a very challenging thing. And so certainly when people like Mildred and William Wells were turning around and saying, hey, some of our most dangerous diseases like tuberculosis, like measles and so on, we think they're airborne. There was certainly a very high bar that they were expected to jump over because, they were essentially telling people like, okay, this whole consensus that you have, we say that's wrong. And you're going to have to set up a different kind of public health strategy. You are going to have to keep the air safe in the same way that we keep the water safe and the food safe. And that's a lot. And unfortunately, I think that basically set people's priors so that they had an unreasonable level of evidence that they would have to see before they would start to even take this possibility seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was sort of my takeaway, I guess, from just kind of reading all these different case studies of the degree to which it seems like the science it's been two steps forward, one step backwards. Like we've sort of arrived, at a more sort of accurate view of how certain diseases spread, but it was not a straight line to get there. Last question on a separate topic. It might be too early to ask this, but what are you thinking for your next book?
I am not working on a book yet. I think after 15 books, I've come to the view that I will wait for an idea for a book to really come to me. In fact, just sort of hit me in the face because it has to be something that is going to be a subject that I'm going to be really excited to follow for maybe a year or two. And also just sort of needs to be the right topic for me at this particular time. And so certainly like life in 2025 is we're definitely living through history, especially when you talk about science. And so right now I'm focusing on my work reporting for the New York Times and just kind of getting a sense of where things are headed and what might be the right book to write next.
Carl Zimmer, author of Air-Borne, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks a lot. It's been great.